go. All right. We are being recorded, so I am going to just go in and start. Welcome, everyone, to reporting using ColdFusion, cloud-based databases, GraphQL, and PDF. My name is Mark Takata. I'm the technical evangelist for ColdFusion, and I'm going to be letting you know about a few cool little techniques to leverage some of the, let's call them non-traditional data sources online. Now, where did this kind of come from? Well, this came from, I've been doing this for about 25 years, and I cannot count the number of times that I have had to pull in data from things that were not databases. Oh, by the way, sorry, before I go any further, yes, this session will be recorded and available. I know that always comes up, and yes, the deck will also be available, and yes, the code will also be available on my GitHub. All of that information is going to be at the end on the last slide. So, sorry, back to untraditional data sources. So, thanks, Scott. Yes, Connect is awesome. Of course, Connect's the best. So what do I consider a non-traditional data source? Well, usually, and actually almost always, it's been something like Excel. Your associates over on the business side of the house pretty much live in Excel. That's how they run. I mean, gosh, I've seen giant, $100 million companies that run on like one or two Excel sheets that have all of these massive amounts of logic built into them, all of the programming code built into them, the functions and everything, and they just run their entire operation on that. It's terrifying. But and I actually spent quite a bit of time converting that stuff into a variety of web applications, including ones that use ColdFusion. But what I'm going to do today is I'm just going to kind of lean into this idea that pretty much we're not going to get rid of Excel. Everyone's going to continue to use Excel. Everyone's going to use Sheets, right? Google Sheets. And so, there's only growth in that industry too, by the way. This is not stuff that's going away. I think at one point we had hoped that maybe we would get some other formats, some other things, like we would make it a little bit easier to pull data out of these things or put data into other formats, right? But it's not happening. It's just not. There's so many of these, and they're kind of low code, no code types of applications online. Airtable is an excellent example of that. I did a talk at Summit about pulling data in and out of Airtable. And Airtable is kind of a hybrid. It's a database slash document database slash spreadsheet. I mean, it kind of does all sorts of things. It's really powerful for what it is. You can actually build apps on top of it. But today I'm going to be talking about something that everyone uses: Google Sheets, right? You can use Google Sheets in like a wide variety of ways. But what I'm doing here is I'm just going to pull a bunch of data, pretending that someone had put a bunch of data into a spreadsheet, and then they said, hey, I want you to generate like a dashboard for me. I want you to generate a PDF for me based on this data. So what am I going to use for my data? Well, I am a big fan of Beat Bobby Flay. It's a show on Food Network where this very famous chef, Bobby Flay, I'm sure you've heard of him, goes up against contestants. And there's been like 20 seasons. There's 300 and something episodes. It's kind of wild how many they have. What's great about that is that somebody went out and actually collated, pulled down all of the data about all of the episodes. And that's actually what you're seeing here that I'm sharing on my screen. This is a bunch of data that someone put, they put it actually into a Kaggle notebook, and they were running statistical analysis on it just to see like who's the better guest, how often does Bobby Flay win, all of that. So we're actually going to do some of that today, and I'm going to show you how to do that. So this is great, right? Like, look at all this data. right? We've got the who's the guest, who was the winner of an episode, the genre. I actually added that column myself. Uh, what the dish was, all of that, right? The contestant. And but the thing is, what are you gonna do with this info? Well, I mean, you could pull it into like a notebook, right? Jupyter notebooks, like if you're good at that kind of thing, if you're good at like stats and whatever, you could pull in a Jupyter notebook. You could put it into Kaggle, which is where I got this from. But we're all ColdFusion programmers here, I think, and we want to leverage ColdFusion for that. So how do I get that into my ColdFusion code? Well, the old way was you write an import script, right? You export this into some sort of format, either CSV or Excel or whatever, and you you take that, you download it to your page, you feed it into your code, and you loop through it, you put it into arrays and all that, right? That's kind of the old way, and I cannot tell you how many times I've done that. I also ran into a lot of problems with that, right? Because there's always the potential that some of the data's weird. That particular way of importing also is kind of ad hoc, right? You're grabbing the data, you're having to download it, process it, do whatever, and then and only then can you actually get stuff out of it. What would be more awesome is if I could have it somewhere in the cloud, right, on Google Sheets, and then access it programmatically, right? So of course, does Google Sheets have an API that you can hit? Yes. Is it something I like? No, not at all. And I think I think other people share this opinion that the API for Google Sheets is a little bit clunky and bulky, and I just don't like to use it. What I do like to use is GraphQL. GraphQL is a somewhat new, although it's been around for a few years. It's a way of querying data, right? That essentially allows you to describe what the data that you're going to get back actually looks like, right? So Google Sheets has a GraphQL endpoint, right? No, it doesn't. Brian Oding says, I would copy and paste into a SQL Server database table after designing the table to match format. That's a really good point, Brian. And the only thing there, though, is you're still doing a one-time thing, right? If the person that created that data in the first place in the very easy to use Google Sheets updated the data, you'd have to copy and paste that again, or create some sort of application that puts the data in and out. And that traditional form of data access and usage is totally still viable. This is just kind of a alternative, right? So back to GraphQL, yeah, like I love to use GraphQL with this, but I can't natively. So what am I going to use? Well, I'm going to use a really cool integration tool called BaseQL. Now, if you guys have been to any of my recent talks, you'll know I've been using GraphQL to access things like Airtables. I've been using it in a variety of different things. And somewhat recently, about a month ago, maybe, they released a new version with a very cool new um, feature that allows you to hit Google Sheets and expose their API very, very, very easily with BaseQL. Super awesome, right? So how do you do it? Well, it's really easy. So you'll start in Google Sheets. You'll have all of your data. And by the way, the structure of the data here is important, okay? If you've got a very designy type of sheet where you're spanning columns and doing all of that type of stuff, it's not going to work. You have to think in a way that is data structure like contextualized, right? So as you'll see here, my first line is actually the column name that I'm going to import in. It automatically does that in BaseQL. The BaseQL essentially says, okay, the first row is the column names, and then every other position here has all of the data in columns. Very well structured, right? So what you will do is you would hit share, right? And this is already shared. And that would give you there'd be a link here. And what you would do in BaseQL is you'd say add new data source, you'd choose Google Sheets and paste that link in. I've already done that. And what you would get is this kind of little button here that you could click. And there we go. Now this is BaseQL's GraphQL Designer. And this is a really awesome tool, even if you're not necessarily using this in production, which by the way, don't use this in production yet. This is still beta, yada, yada, you know how it is. I know some people use beta stuff in production. Me, that's okay. But if you are in any way interested in learning how to create GraphQL, which, spoiler alert, you probably should be. This is a great way to learn it. BaseQL is free. You can just use it as much as you want. As far as I know, there's not actually any transfer limits or anything like that at the moment. And what you'll see here is this actually has connected to my sheet and pulled back that first row as columns, right? So let's say I want to pull back data from that sheet and I want the air date, both of the contestants, the dish genres, maybe the first two guests, what ingredients they used, and who the winner was, maybe the title. So what's happening here? This is actually building for you a native GraphQL query, right? And that's what they look like. And yeah, really simple, right? It's not like SQL select from where left, whatever, all that. None of that, right? This is what it's going to come back as also. And you'll kind of notice this kind of a little bit looks like JSON, which is funny because what you get back is JSON. And that's sort of the magic of this. And you can kind of see, you'll note this matches that, that matches that, right? And so when you start using this, it begins to become kind of like second nature. In fact, when I go back and write queries and mutations and things like that in SQL now, I kind of have to get out of this mode of trying to write things the same way as they're going to come back, because they don't in that particular format. So awesome. Okay, right on. So we got everything that we need now, right? Well, almost. So this is a current. I don't want to say it's a failing or anything like that, but it's not currently in ColdFusion that you can just take a raw GraphQL query and send it to a GraphQL endpoint. That doesn't exist right now. I'm hoping maybe at some point it will, but in the meantime, what you can do very effectively is you can merely hit that endpoint the same way as you might with like curl. You'd use CFHTTP. So that's what I'm doing up here. To do that, we're going to start off by taking, by the way, can everyone read my screen okay? Should be, yeah, okay. It looks pretty good on my screen. Hopefully that works. I'm going to create for myself a query string as a string. And as you can see, it looks a lot like what you saw there on the screen, but a little bit different. This is actually being generated as a valid JSON, right? The other one was not a valid JSON necessarily, right? Well, because anyway, yeah, it wasn't valid JSON. So you're going to say query Beat Bobby Flay is the sheet that you're going to call, and then these are the returns that you're going to get from that sheet. So pause for a moment. One issue with this particular technique currently, they're working on it, I'm not sure if it'll ever change, is currently mutations are not supported when hitting the sheet using this method. Okay, this is read only. And apparently it's a non-trivial type of situation to get over. Google Sheets really doesn't want to be written to remotely. So I asked if they I actually found out about this about a month ago. I had like some kind of talk that I was doing a week later, and I asked them, "Hey, are you going to have it done by the week?" And one of their engineers just kind of like side-eyed me and said, "No, we're working on it, but no." So that is something to keep in mind if your workflow actually requires you to write back to whatever that online data source is, that cloud-based online data source is. I would instead choose something like Airtable, which does accept mutations. Um, so, Tim, that's a really good question. So, Tim asks, since this is a space delimited list, what do you do if there are column headers with spaces? So, this is so what I actually had done. It was comma separated, which of course creates other issues potentially too. You do have to convert. So column headers must be in a format that is viable as a column header in a database. So no special characters, no spaces, right? It's kind of the same way if you try and have a SQL database with columns with funny stuff in it, you're not going to be able to query it. So that is actually a limitation here. Um, and of course, if you have, for example, um, uh, oh, and sorry, and the one thing too that'll also happen is GraphQL, just by its very nature. Uh, I mean, yes, they're my column headers, but also the column headers that are there. I just it happened that all of those column headers did not have spaces. And the reason why is in Kaggle, when you're actually hitting those, you also cannot have spaces. It's kind of a universal, right? Like if you have spaces in your column headers, things go horribly wrong very quickly. So that is a conversion that you might have to do. Actually, GraphQL natively does remove spaces by itself, but I hate to rely on that because then what you're accessing is not what you're actually looking at, if that makes sense. So yeah, this is a little bit of ETL that you have to do, a little bit of transform. You do have to make sure your column headers are viable and valid. Um, so as you can see here, this is the query that I'm designing, and then the very next line, I'm actually passing into CFHTTP the endpoint for my sheet, right? And looking at that, it's api.basql.com /G Sheets, which controls their Google Sheet stuff. GraphQL, which is going to be the output, and then right here, this request.basql API key. So I'm hiding that because that's a if you guys had that, you could go in and I guess you could read my data, which isn't that big a deal. And something with a mutation, you could theoretically. I don't have this locked down behind a secret key on the actual site. I have this fully open because I was just playing with it. But what that key looks like is just like a GUID, basically, or like a long string of characters and numbers. But you can very easily see that on the actual page. In fact, it's here. So you can kind of see part of it is hidden at the very end, but that's kind of what that looks like normally. So I'm going to pass that in. The method is going to be post. And then I name the result as result. And I add a few headers here. So I add an accept header and a content type header, both of which are application JSON. So I'm putting in JSON. I'm expecting JSON back. And then as the body of my post, I'm actually passing in the GraphQL query string, which will be interpreted as the query when it hits the endpoint, coming back with my result in JSON format. So I am going to just show you what that looks like in raw format. There it is. So that's what you're going to get back from that endpoint in sort of that raw CFHTTP return, right? You've got the car error detail. No, there were no errors. You've got your file content that's coming back, which is a giant JSON string. And of course, your headers, your MIME types, response, status 200, right? So that's awesome. That's easy, right? Not super useful yet. So let's transform that a little bit. And the first thing that I'm going to do, and this is a little bit of a dance, and definitely, by the way, this code, I'm sure all of you could write it better. I'm definitely not the world's best programmer. I just sort of get stuff done. So, there's a few things that I'm doing in here that some of you might, eyebrow, give me the old people's eyebrow or side eye. But definitely let me know. I would love to improve the way that I'm doing my stuff. So let's clean this up a little bit. I'm going to deserialize that stuff. And I'm just going to pull back what's in the file content section of that struct that's getting returned, because that's all I want. So if I go in and do that, oh, wait a minute. Remember, folks, doing demos in live code is always fun. All right, there we go. So now I get a struct, which contains a struct, which contains an array with more structs inside of it. And you can sort of, that array of structs kind of looks like a query return, which it is. But having all this other stuff around it is not great. So at this point, I'm going to do a couple of things. And some of this is optional. Some of this is useful. You can choose what you want to do with your particular code. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to create an array. And that array is just going to be the stuff inside of data.beatBobbyFlay. And what does that look like? So that looks like that. Nice, right? So now this is useful. This is something we can loop through. We could loop through this array. We could pull back all of the items inside the struct if we wanted to. Totally easy. But I'm lazy. So what I'm actually going to do, and I'm going to do this a couple of times in two different ways. This is just some code that if you would like to use it, it's useful. And by the way, I think this first one comes via the amazing and legendary Ray Camden. So what am I doing here? This is a function called array to query. And yes, by the way, this is all in one. This is all in one file. You should definitely not do this. You should have a CFC that you call out for a function and all that. I just wanted everything in one place. It's a little bit easier for me to do my talk this way. So what's happening here? Oh, and by the way, sorry, one last thing that I did. I actually put the array that I just created back into a JSON string in case I want to, for example, drop that into like a data table if I wanted to use a data table in that particular way, or whatever else you want to do with JSON. Having it JSON format can be useful. So I just throw that in there. Then I write this function here, and this function just basically, in simple terms, creates a query from the array that I had, right? So I write that function, and then I drop that array that I had into my function, and ta-da! Now we have a query object with a return. So this is the equivalent, by the way, of you having, as you mentioned earlier, a SQL Server database with all of this data in it, and basically at that point doing a query against it and returning, and it's a select star. Basically, I'm returning all of those different columns and returning all that data back. So you're saying, well, wait a minute. Well, why did you just do that in the first place? Aha, right. The whole idea here is that in this particular case, you want to keep that complexity and difficulty out of the hands of your business team. They are not programmers, not DBAs. They may not be comfortable dealing inside of SQL Server, right? You may not want to, pay for the seat for someone to log into that SQL Server. You may not want to expose that SQL Server access to somebody, right? You may just say, hey, just put it in a sheet and I can just connect to it and get this return. So that's kind of the point here that I'm trying to make with that. Cool. Okay. So now that we have data, we're gonna do a few things. Okay. And I'm gonna go through this a little bit quickly because we don't have, an infinite amount of time. So what am I doing here? I am now going to do a bunch of queries and put them into memory, right? And what I'm going to be doing first, by the way, is creating a dashboard for someone to use to view and display a few different points of the data. I'm going to do a little bit of, like light stats analysis on the data. It's kind of a fun C-suite level overview of what's coming back with the data. And it includes a little bit of stuff that they can do themselves if they want to look a few things up, right? So to do that, I'm taking the query, which by the way is now in memory, right? I generated that earlier. I put a query into memory using that function. Now I'm going to do a bunch of CF queries. MS Online. Jeff, that's a really good question. Sorry, one second. Elliot Jordan asks, can we get the recording link code? Yes, we will be. I will be posting this onto my GitHub, which the link will be shown later. You'll get all this code that you can use yourselves. And the recording link will be on our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/Adobe ColdFusion. I believe next week, depending on if we have time to get it in maybe earlier. I'm not sure. Aishwarya will be doing that for us, so it kind of depends what she all has on her plate. This process is not available currently for MS Online Office Sheets, Jeff. However, I will say if there is an API endpoint that's available that Microsoft has available for that product, maybe GraphQL will, or maybe BaseQL will actually write that in as a new beta product. I can ask them. They are also on Twitter and on LinkedIn, so feel free to reach out to them yourself and ask. They want to hear back from folks. They're trying to expand their product line, so if that is of interest to you, definitely ping them. I think it's just at BaseQL at Twitter. And I'll ask as well on they dropped me into their Slack a while back. So okay, so what am I doing with all my queries here? So the first one is I'm doing a little bit of cleanup, and this is something to keep in mind. And this is also something which I guess a lot of people don't really talk about when you're talking about reporting and you're talking about what you're putting to screen. The data that you get is not necessarily what you want to end up putting on the screen, right? Because often the data is malformed in some way. It doesn't show you the exact output or result that you're trying to pull out. And I'm not saying do something where it biases the data, but often there's a story behind the data. And this query right here actually tells a really big story. And I don't want to get too deeply into it because I don't have all the time in the world. But there was about a week of the show that this data comes from, Bobby Flay, where the two guests that are normally on the show, one of them would end up battling Bobby instead of two chefs that were coming in from the outside. That massively changes the data that you get back because it ends up creating gaps and empty spaces where the secondary guest is, which shouldn't matter, but it does matter for one of the item points that I wanted to show. And also, it's a massive change in the actual data that comes back. That entire week, Bobby lost every single match. And it was a totally different format, right? It was a totally different way of doing the show. So, taking that up a level, if the data that you're showing has a gap in it that just massively changes, it's an outlier, right? And if that outlier causes some issues, often you want to find some way around it. So, my way around it is I am just removing that week by removing the records where guest 2 is not there. Okay. And this is a very particular niche example, but trust me, this happens all the time, all the time. Okay, so I'm just gonna kind of go down the line here. Here, I'm just pulling back everything from the result query into chart query. The reason, actually, this doesn't even need to exist. The reason I had done this originally was I was going to do some filtering, and I kind of ran out of time for that. Now here I'm pulling back all of the winners into a set of characters. This one, I'm actually pulling back only the results where Bobby Flay was the winner. Here I'm actually counting the genres, right? And so what I mean by that is how many of each of the genres were actually there for the show, right? And it's a very important statistical thing because in this case, again, context matters, right? We want to kind of know the interest that people always have is what areas does Bobby Flay not do well in, right? And this, if you extend this out, what days of the week does your product sell best on, right? That kind of thing is very important. And so here I'm actually counting the number of genres where Bobby Flay was was competing in. And then here, this is really fun. This is again a very data specific problem, but you'll run into these too. And let me show you really quickly here what I'm talking about. So what I wanted to find out was how often each of the guest stars, the people that come in, which are often Food Network chefs and occasionally celebrities, I wanted to find out who amongst the regulars, because people always come back to it, win the most against Bobby, right? And that should be very easy to do. You just count the ones where they are the winner. The problem is that the data was not being happy. So sometimes in the guest 1 column, you would find the actual guest name, but other times it would be in guest 2. And so essentially what I had to do here was I had to count each of them and combine them together, right? And this is a mishmash. I apologize to anyone for whom this is painful to look at. But this is essentially what I'm doing. I go through and I loop through one column and I use that column to pull back data from the second column on the top chefs. And I add those things together into a new, excuse me, into a new array. And then I actually, is it here that I do it? At some point, I actually, oh yes, I put it back into a query. So this query here, this function here actually takes an array and puts it into a query. Seems familiar, right? Did that earlier. This is actually Ben Nadal's code, and it's a little bit less complicated than Ray Camden's code from before, but does a very similar thing. So these are a couple of different ways that you can take an array, which often we're going to have arrays that are given back to us, or we have to manipulate data sets into arrays, but we might want to then use them as a query. For example, using CF output query, right? Like you might want to do that, or you might want to subquery and do a query of queries of that query. You could do that with an array, but in ColdFusion, come on, it's much easier to do it when it's a query object. And then at the very end, and in fact, that's what I do here, is I then sort that list that I just created from the two separate columns being combined together in another query, and I output that. All right, so then here, what I'm doing is I'm actually generating a number for the amount, for the percentage amount that Bobby Flay wins. Okay, because I thought that would be an interesting thing. Okay, that's all. That's all the boring stuff. And feel free to use. I'm not sure how useful this code will be for anyone in the future, um, but you can kind of get a sense of like what you can do to create, for example, a dashboard for someone using this style of numbers. So the rest of the things here are pretty standard, right? And just real quick, I want to show you what the final look is. Oops. Live code. Where's my abort? Save. Boop. Is that a pretty isn't that a pretty thing? There we go. Okay. Much better. So that right there is my end goal. This is the dashboard that I want to create for, I don't know, theoretical C-suite. That's the theoretical CEO of the Bobby Flay Appreciation Society Corporation, right? She said, I want to have a dashboard that gives me this particular set of things. I want to be able to see these particular items, and I want to be able to go to a site and see all that, and maybe do a little bit of searching, maybe do a little bit of looking at it, and then have an export functionality, which we'll get to. So there we go. So this is the number that I came up with earlier by basically counting the total number of episodes that are in there and how often Bobby won them. And by the way, as mentioned earlier, that is actually not, an exact number, right? Because we are removing that week and a half or whatever where his friends came and whooped his booty very, very well. Because that was not really necessarily a fair, a fair fight, you might say. I have a feeling some of those episodes might have been somewhat staged, but don't quote me on that. And what you can tell there also is, if you look here, you've got 299 entries, right? This is the total number of episodes that I'm using to create all of this data. But if I go back to my sheet, yeah, I have 306 entries, right? Because remember, the first row is a column heading, right? And so anyway, and this is kind of, this is a thing about reports is, if you just dump the data out, I mean, it's not useful, right, to have that data dump of all of the data, right? Nobody wants that. In fact, that's what they had put in as the data earlier. Your job as a developer and a report designer is to take that and make it into something a little bit more useful, something that people can look at and say, wow, Bobby Flay wins 64% of the time. That's amazing, right? That's better than 50-50, and much better than me if I was on the show. Mine would be 0% because I can't cook. What are the top 5 guest winners? And this data is coming back from that little manipulation where I was taking the guest 1 and the guest 2 rows, combining the wins of all of the people, and then taking the top 5 here. So Alex Garnaschelli won 19 times in her time on the show. Now, this is the fun part, and this is where biases come into play. And it's very important to consider context, right? So you might think here that Alex Garnaschelli is the best guest to have if you want to go on the show and beat Bobby Flay. That is actually, well, maybe not totally true. Because what I'm not showing here, and this is where biases can come into play, is sometimes what you don't show can have a really big effect on the reality and the truth of your data. So Alex Garnaschelli won 19 times, but she was on the show 48 times. That is less than a 50% win rate, right? Which is still pretty good considering Bobby Flay wins 64% of the time. However, let's look at what's her name? So there is another chef here. Of course, I'm going to forget her name. She's an Italian chef. Sorry, I'm not going to waste your time with that. There is another chef here, by the way, that has a 62% win rate, but she was only on the show about 8 times. So whatever number of wins that would be, or like a 60% win rate. In any case, it's a better percentage than Alex Gornishelli, but because she was only on the show 8 times, she does not come in at the top 5. So I did this very much on purpose to show you when you're designing these things, keep those things in mind. Keep the things that people want to know and learn about in mind, because there's a possibility that they could get a wrong idea about how well your business is doing, right? Or how well someone's performance is, or whatever it is that you're creating a dashboard on, if you're not displaying the right data here. Right. The next thing is actually kind of interesting. This is something that I get a lot of feedback from folks online about, and that is charting. So let's scroll down and take a look there. So charts in ColdFusion have been maybe not given as much love as we should be giving them. And we are working on that. We're trying to find ways to improve this. But I did want to show that you can still create a really nice chart using the built-in CF chart that is in your ColdFusion. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm creating a chart that's in pie format with solid slices. There's all kinds of different options that you can do. I set show 3D as true, and then I use the count genres query that I put earlier, and I actually order that by the top number, and then I max rows that to 10 and put it into the items here, and that results in this, I don't know, pretty good looking pie chart. As far as I'm concerned, it's probably better than something I could just kind of do off the cuff. Now, are there other formats and other toolings and things that you can use? Yes, absolutely. There are tons of charting tool sets out there. Chart.js, right, is probably one of the most popular. D3, also extremely popular. And you can take the data that you are generating here and put that into other types of charting and visualization software like Tableau, like all kinds. I mean, you could even theoretically pull it into something like R or one of the Python libraries that does charting. Really, there is no limit to where you can take this data after you've done some work with it. And that's something that you're going to see people do a lot, because ColdFusion is really, really good at that. Right. In fact, I think I have someone here that does a ton of ETL. Scotty, I see you. They do a lot of data transfer and do a lot of transformation to that to put it into another system. In their case, nobody actually necessarily sees the data right after ColdFusion is done with it. It goes into a different system for use by that system, right? So there's so many options that you can do here. So this isn't exactly, the end all be all, but if all you want to do, there's Scotty, if all you want to do is just put up a chart, there's a lot of options here. We've got bar charts, we've got pie, we've got scatter plots. All of those are built into ColdFusion. They all, excuse me, still work, and they look pretty good. Now, I will say, definitely, if you need to do it like this afternoon, don't just dive in, do a little bit of research, because to make these look exactly the way that you want to, you need to learn some of the context, the way the syntax, sorry, on how it works. You have to actually put in like structures and stuff that can explain, well, I want it to have this particular set of features. I want the bevel to be like this. I want the color to be like that. All of that is actually available and exposed. It's just maybe a little bit of work to learn how to do all that. But I still think it's easier to do that in ColdFusion than it is in some of the other charting formats, especially D3, which is essentially like trying to bake with a supermarket's worth of ingredients, right? They don't give you a lot of pre-built types of things. So that was the chart. And I'm kind of running out of time a little bit here. I've got about 15 minutes, and I'd like to spend the last 10 minutes doing Q&A. So I'm going to run through this last part kind of quickly. What in the world is this? Well, this is a data table. This is a free library that you can get. It runs off of jQuery that takes a big data set, usually tabular format, of course, and puts it into this really, really nice interface. So you've got this here. Let's say you wanted to know, I don't know, like how many times Scott Conant was on the show. You can just write in the search and you can see there's 40 entries here, right? So he has been on 40 shows, right? So little things like that are actually just built in. If you wanted to do a sort on the data based on, let's say, the air date, that is built in automatically. It just comes in. So let's look at how that happens real quick. What I do, and by the way, again, this is one of those rabbit holes. There are so many options for data tables. It is a little bit amazing, right? The way I'm doing it is the simplest way. They call it the no setup way. And all I do is I actually create my table here, and I've got my headers, and then I just use ColdFusion to output the contents of the query. And I do a little tricksy thing here where, if the winner is Bobby Flay, then I make the background dark gray, just so you can kind of see that. Visually, again, it's giving a visual indicator of how often something happens. This is part of being a report designer. So you can look at that and very clearly see, hey, there's a lot of dark gray there on the right. Now, you could also, of course, do red or something, but I wanted to be a little more subtle than that. I output that. And then down here, it is literally this. It's actually literally this easy, but I do wrap it in a document.ready function to make sure that everything is rendered and loaded. And then you just say ID of the table, data table. Poof, it does it. It goes in, and it looks like that. There's lots of themes you can apply. As you saw, you can actually style it very easily. It's pretty awesome stuff. All right. Well, I mentioned earlier that our CEO came to you and said, I want to have a dashboard. And she also said, I want to export it to PDF. Now, there's something to talk about here, and that is that often in the past, when you were doing exports of things, the idea was that those exports were going to be printed, right? And in some cases, data tables will also export to PDF. I did not know that, Tim. That's awesome. Well, shoot. Let's go out drinking. Well, I'm still going to show you because I actually do a little bit more than just export this data table, but that's really good to know. And yeah, again, like this is one of those things. If you've got a Saturday free and you're looking to learn something, go and take a look at data tables. They are ridiculously full featured and very, very nice to use. So, and by the way, I use them all the time. You can just link them to JSON. You can link them to an endpoint that delivers JSON to you and pull out of that. I mean, it's super awesome. Yes, and it pulls back. Yeah, nice, and it pulls back to CSV. So in this case, let's theoretically say the CEO was like not necessarily saying I want just the data back, although that is useful. She actually wanted a kind of a report that's not necessarily something you're going to print, maybe, but it could be. But is an electronic format thing that she could then take and give to maybe the board of directors or something, right? And so we're going to do that. So how are we going to do that in ColdFusion? Oh my goodness, I have like a minute. Sorry, everyone. I kind of went a little bit long here. So what you're seeing here is essentially the exact same code as in my index. I pull back all of the data, I do all of my functions, I do all of that, which many of you are saying, Mark, you're doing that wrong. You should be pulling that externally. Yes, totally right. This should be in some kind of CFC. But again, for simplicity's sake and just to use as a learning guide, I just kind of put that in here so you can see it all in one place. When you're doing this in production, you're building a scalable system. Yes, please, separation of concerns, code reuse, simplify all of that good thing. But the difference here is this line. So I am using CF document to generate this PDF. Why? Well, it's really easy. There are other options out there to do that. I just happen to want to use this. One thing to keep in mind is if you are on CF 2021 and you are running it in the minimal mode where all the packages are not put in, you do have to make sure that you've got the package for PDF installed for the document stuff. So if anybody needs me to show them that, please throw that question in the chat, and I can do that in a little bit when we're doing questions. So what I've done here is I just wrapped all of the content that I want in a PDF in CF document, and I made it that format. And I did a little bit of like I removed some of the divs. I made it just a little bit simpler because occasionally PDFs can be troublesome. So let's look and see what that looks like. And here we are. So immediately it's a little bit different looking, and that's okay, right? This is still totally fine. We've got 64% win percentage. And of course, you might ask, well, why is it different? Well, because I removed some of the divs, because I didn't want the libraries like loading into this and kind of futzing with it. I just simplified it a lot. As you can see, you still get the image that was loaded before. What you don't get here, though, and this is important, is you don't get the mouse over numbers in each of these. So keep that in mind. If you actually are trying to represent those numbers, you might want to add them to the labels, perhaps, or something along those lines. And then we get our tabular data that just comes out. And I've got it paginating with a header at the top of each page. Okay, how am I doing that? So I'm cheating a little bit here. And this is kind of why I was talking earlier about printing. In this case, we really just wanted this to be something that someone could go through and look at. So I went in and essentially inside of the loop that, well, first of all, to make the first page break, I created this div with page break before and page break after. That's going to force a page break in there. And then what I'm doing is I'm actually creating what I call a break timer. So this guy here counts to 40 records and then resets. And every time it resets, it ends my table and puts in a break with a new header at the top of it to generate this. Pretty cool, right? And it works. Now, this is something that has come up quite a lot. People will be using this and their breaks are not working, their headers are not working, they're trying to use fancy things. Those will work sometimes, and there are people much better at generating PDFs that will use that. For me, this is how I've always done it, and this works pretty much 100% of the time for me. You do have to get a little bit fancy, make sure that you're making up for, like, well, in some cases these will actually break or do whatever. But this is something that you can put out as a report, and this is something that's really important for people to understand. When you're building reports, at least in my experience over the last quarter of a century, reports for me in the places that I've worked at tend to be ad hoc things. They're used once a year, maybe once a month, maybe. but often those things end up changing. So creating something that is, you know, beautiful and perfect and all that, I found that it really just made life a little bit more difficult for me, right? These types of things tend to be things that change yearly. Give you a great example. I had to write a report when I was working for UC Davis Financial Aid. That report was reporting on federal guidelines for financial aid at the school. It was a yearly report. Guess what changes every year? The federal guidelines for financial aid change every year. That thing had to be rewritten nearly every single year as it changed. The calculations changed. The output changed. What was supposed to go there had to change. We had to alter the logos on it, and sometimes even the colors, as the university changed its colors at one point. So it's something to think about. You always want to program in the most elegant and beautiful way that you possibly can, and you want to be really efficient. You don't want to put out a lot of ugly, bad code if you can help it. But sometimes in issues like this, you got to find that balance point, right? So let's see, that's my PDF. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead. Running a little late on questions, so we've got about 4 minutes. If you have any questions, um, let's go ahead and put them. Actually, if you wouldn't mind, I should have said this at the beginning. I've got a Q&A pod. If you wouldn't mind putting the questions in there, I know a lot of them have gone into chat, which I'll be downloading that as well. Or I guess since we've just been doing it in the chat, who cares? Go ahead and put them in there. If you have any questions, please put them in. Right up here, though, this is all the information for me. My email is takata@adobe.com. Please feel free to email me if you have any questions. On Twitter, I am at Mark Takata. Go ahead and follow me there. DM me, text me, whatever, say hi. I'm on Twitch every Wednesday at 1 p.m. at twitch.tv or twitch.com/Mark Takata. Please feel free to come by and see me. I run a show called Fool Around and Find Out, where often I'm working on webinars just like this. And you can maybe get a preview of things or ask me questions or maybe even learn a little bit about coding. My GitHub repo is there. It's github.com/Mark R. Takata. Somebody took Mark Takata. Grr. And you will find all kinds of code from CF Summits to my webinars to just me fooling around and putting some things up there. And my LinkedIn is, of course, Mark Takata. I'm on the CFML Slack, and as Mark Takata Adobe, and I do have daily office hours at this very location at myadobeconnect.com/Mark Takata. If you ever want to come by on Mondays from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, I am here just hanging out on camera with my mic. If you want to come by and chat, please feel free. My door is always open, and do feel free to ask questions. Tim Barth says, using GraphQL BaseQL is new to me and can be helpful in certain circumstances. Yeah, Tim, it's really cool. I mean, I have to say I'm kind of a convert to it. I love to use it, and at this point, I kind of choose to use it if I have that option. And we are definitely looking at what we can do to expand and make it easier to use GraphQL with ColdFusion. A lot of us think it's probably one of the future things. Like, we started with SOAP, we got REST. It kind of feels like GraphQL may be that next big thing. A lot of big companies are using it, right? I mean, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Pinterest, Spotify, the list goes on. There is a ton of companies that use GraphQL, and that list is only growing. And I think for us as ColdFusion developers, it's an important thing to be able to incorporate into our workflow. Well, you're very welcome. Well, if nobody has any other questions, or if you do have questions that maybe you want to share privately with me or email me, please feel free to email me any questions you have. It's been wonderful talking with all of you, and yeah, just let me know how this all works out. data tables. We use the editor version, CRUD version of data tables, ColdFusion. Nice, Gobi, very cool. Yeah, no, it's all of these tools, and this is just something that I love to kind of talk about. Is ColdFusion is one of the tools in your arsenal, right? Uh, you can use other things with it so easily because it is so flexible and integrates so well with so many other toolings, and you can build really beautiful and cool things like this very, very quickly, and kind of become the hero of your office. So. Oh, thanks, Tom. Tom says, many thanks, Mark. Cool presentation. Thank you. Glad to see you there. Very cool. Okay. Well, Aishwarya, I think we can stop the recording. I'm going to hang out for another 5 minutes. If anyone has any further questions or anything like that, please feel free to put them into chat or into the Q&A.